Okay, let's begin. So, we are going to talk about developing mastering in middle to late childhood. Now, I have organized this a little differently. I have organized my presentation a little differently than the textbook because I really want to emphasize developing mastery as an important, majorly important aspect of middle to late childhood. It's the thing that children this age are doing. It's what they're actively involved in. And it's also that the physical and the cognitive developments in middle to late childhood allow children to rapidly gain these skills and abilities. And mastering these skills and discovering these abilities is a really important part of the child's emerging sense of self. And one thing that I want to point out, so we looked at the emerging self in preschool, just beginning. What's happening in middle to late childhood is they're starting to form and solidify their sense of self. So what you understand that you are good at or bad at in this time period is going to have lasting effects. That's why looking at this time period through the lens of they're developing mastery in the world, I think is particularly useful. And Erickson had a similar insight when he identified this time frame as the industry versus inferiority stage. And by industry, he really was talking about being able to develop competence, doing something well in the world, meeting the challenges of the world. So, can I run? Can I jump? Can I dance? Can I sing? Can I think? Can I do math? Can I write? All of these skills are important and they're being developed at this time. So, children starting in early childhood, especially, and it sort of changes as you hit later childhood, but you're answering this question of who am I by here's what I can do. Look at this. So, let's just talk about physical development during this time. It's a couple of things. So, middle childhood is roughly based between age 6 to 11, and it's marked by slow and steady growth. There's not a lot of growth spurts during this time, but it's coming on. Girls tend to be taller than boys in this time, and they're just stronger, sturdier bodies. Gross motor skills come online. Uh, So essentially, there tends to be some gender differences. And this chart, which I actually got from a different textbook, sort of highlights what some of the gender differences are. For example, girls are better at the accuracy of their gross motor skills, whereas boys are better at the force, at less complex tasks. Um, but then you can see that there's, the ability to throw, to skip, to balance on a beam, can correctly execute a jumping jack at age 7. It's kind of cute to see younger children try to do a jumping jack, and this sort of the ability comes online. Um, the degree to which you can throw a ball, um, uh, that changes over time, and how fast you can run. All of these things are just coming online. You're getting better and better and better as you go over your childhood years. Even if you're not that good at running, you're better than you were when you were 7. So, and we're going to see that my comment, even if you're not that good at running, that I'm going to question even that way of thinking, because as we help children develop during this time, being good at or bad at something is actually can be fairly thinking about things that way can be fairly problematic. And we're going to talk about different ways to think about it. But we want to acknowledge that all of this is developing. And now I picked this video to sort of start this, really think about this idea of developing mastery, because there's something, well, in one part, because learning to ride a bike is a gross motor skill. It's very, very complex. And I wanted to show you how parents or adults can be involved in children mastering skills by simply structuring the tasks in a way that makes the child able to master them. And so I'm going to maybe not. I'm going to watch some of this video and skip around a little bit of it so you can get the feel of how this really super calm English lady is teaching this probably 5 or maybe 6-year-old, maybe younger.
Learning to ride a bike is a rite of passage for most children, but it can end in frustration. So here are some simple steps to help you get started and make it a fun experience for all.
And I'm just going to stop for a second and tell you how much of a mistake I made when teaching my own son to ride a bike. I did not watch this lady's video, and I really wish I had. I'm skipping the part here where she is just checking the safety. And now, let's see. And now she's going to help the girl get on the bike.
Lean it over a bit, swing your leg over, and then you can sit on the saddle. Both of their feet should be flat on the ground, and both hands should be on the brake levers. Get them to squeeze both brakes gently at the same time. Okay, now you're ready to start scooting. So just let go of the brakes and push down on the ground and off you go. Push down on the ground with your feet, that's it. When they want to stop, tell them to squeeze both brakes gently at the same time and put their feet down, only when the bike has stopped. Remind them to look where they're going, not down at their feet. They need to sit up and look straight ahead. Learning to balance is instinctive for some children, others might need a bit more practice. Encourage them to steer into the turn and move with the bike. Now they can scoot with their feet off the ground, play a few games. Get them to scoot over to a cone and stop as close to it as they can. Once they can balance, it's time to use the pedals. So teach them to put the brakes on with one foot firmly on the ground and with the other foot set the pedal at 2 o'clock. That means in line with the frame. So now you're ready to start pedaling. Let go of your brakes, get your foot up onto the pedal in this position, and when you're ready, push off. Do this a few times until they are balancing really well and pedaling by themselves. Tell them to keep pedaling and stop when you say.
So you can see how she breaks it down into these different tasks of, first, like, how do you even get on the bike? And then um, here's how you practice just squeezing the brakes. And now you're just going to scoot and you're going to practice stopping while scooting. So before you even try to do this complex balance thing, you have all of these other skills being mastered. You did a great job stopping at that cone, right? And now what is adorable is you can see that she's pretty excited all the way through. She's given these little tasks that she can do, and it's the act of mastering the task that allows her to then move on to the next task. So by the time she say stop, she's now pedaling, she's balancing, and she's stopping on a dime, right? She's been practicing that. And she's demonstrating to the adult, the mom, let's just say, that when she says, okay, stop, that she can do it. So there's this experience of fun and ability and capability that's being built incrementally. And it's not because the girl is, I'm a good bike rider. It's because she's mastering each component task as it comes up. Maybe at the end she can say, I'm a good bike rider. But the point here is what the adult can do to structure the task to build mastery. Also, I want you to reflect on the calm, cool, and positive, uh, uh, without being too positive, but this calm, cool, collected way that the parent is. That's not how I was when I taught my own son, and I regret it to this day. That's probably why I'm showing you this video. Also, I want to point out that I found this video in relatively short amount of time. So anything that you're facing as a parent or working with children, there's probably a video on YouTube with that you can use your child development insight that you're learning in this class to look for high quality videos that will actually help you do what you're looking to do. As an example of a fine motor skill, tying your shoe would be a fine motor skill. Um, I'm not going to show you this video, but this actually shows you how to tie your shoe in a way that doesn't come untied and doesn't involve double knotting, and you can relatively easily pull it undone when you're over. So if you want to find the better way to tie a shoe, watch the video. Moving on to cognitive changes, let's our old friend Piaget. We looked at him during the preschool years, and we saw a video of the children when they were younger in the pre-operational stage. They weren't able to distinguish between to conserve the amount of water, so they poured the water from the fat glass into the tall, skinny glass, and the younger child said, "There's more water in that glass." And the older child was able to sort of trace the amount of water, work backwards, and say, sort of reverse the operation. That's Piaget's definition of an operation. She could sort of reverse it, think, where did it come from and how did it get there? And did it change between? So the older child was able to say, that's the same amount of water, because logic would dictate it. But one thing about Piaget's concrete operational stage is the emphasis on concrete, the emphasis on the real, the emphasis on objects. So during this time, as they're interacting with the world, this is also consistent with what Erickson was saying, where they're mastering the aspects of their world. And they're also, like, the advances in their cognitive ability allows them to master different aspects of their world and manipulate them in their mind instead of just by touching. Another point that the book emphasized, which I think is awesome, is the rise of metacognition. Metacognition is simply thinking about thinking. And if used, you can teach metacognitive skills, and when you do so, kids tend to be more successful when they're taught metacognitive strategies, because it can help a kid transition from "I can't" to "how can I?" This is also in keeping with our theme of developing mastery, because something that is happening in kids is they are interpreting their abilities as they try new things and succeed or fail. So teaching metacognitive skills, where you can actually teach people to think about their thoughts and question, and even question critically, like, is that actually true? Is that actually helpful? Is there another way to look at it? So an example might be the child saying, "Boy, math tests make me anxious." The metacognition involves wondering, what is it about math tests that make me so anxious, and what can I do to change it? For example, for me, I get anxious when there's a right or wrong answer. I'm a lot more comfortable with tests, at least I was when I was that age, with writing examples or doing well on expressing myself, because there wasn't a right or a wrong answer. And that meant I didn't go into engineering, and I didn't study anything scientific until my later adult life, because I was so anxious at the idea of getting something wrong. So what could I have done to change that if I'd been engaged in metacognitive or worked on it with my parents or a teacher? To rethink that is, I may have worked harder at, say, forgiving myself for getting a wrong answer and reinterpreting it as, oh, the wrong answer is just an opportunity to learn to not do what I did wrong that first time. They're just different ways to think about it metacognitively. A child might also be struggling to complete homework writing at home, and they may think, "I'm bad at writing." They may be like, "I'm so bad at writing," because their affect is low, and then they're interpreting their low affect in some way, and they're not sophisticated about how they may be interpreting their lives and their circumstance, and they may and the sort of easiest thing to think, the sort of default mode, is, "I'm bad at this." Now, with metacognitive coaching or emotion coaching, you could actually have them identify that negative self talk. Have them identify a thought that says, "I'm bad at this," as a red flag that must be reconsidered. This is probably not true. And there may be other possibilities. And so as you know, as you help children understand how to think metacognitively, you could say, maybe you're just tired and need a break, right? And and that involves us being a little bit metacognitive too, because we're thinking about our thinking, we're thinking about their thinking, and it's a way of coaching them into not necessarily just accepting their default thought, but actually thinking about where did that thought come from, and should I even buy into it? And doing this improves self-regulation and reduces negative self-talk. So another thing that comes online as language develops during this time, it's really fun because kids start to enjoy jokes much more. And if you think about a joke, you have to have a very complex understanding of the language in order to have a joke. One of the languages that I studied in my young adult life was um, French, and I lived in France, and so it was quite an accomplishment for me to begin to learn to be able to make a joke in France. It meant that I could understand a whole lot. But here we have an example of things that children find funny, and um, you can see how this plays with language and the different meaning of language. So, what do you call a pig that knows karate? Boom, a pork chop. Why was the man running around his bed? He wanted to catch up on his sleep. Ha ha ha. How did the barber win the race? He knew a shortcut. Ha. So these are all plays on words, catch up on his sleep, and a shortcut, which could also mean the haircut, right? So you get all of these because you're complex, but it's kind of hilarious to see the delight that children get when playing with language this way. I'm going to talk a little bit about intelligence testing. First of all, the history was in France. Alfred Binet was asked to determine which students needed extra instruction, in school. They wanted to make sure in France they were very egalitarian at that time, and they wanted to make sure that all students got a chance to succeed in life, and that meant that identifying children who needed more help. So, thus, intelligence testing was largely focused on that which predicted academic success. So when we think about an IQ, you really have to think about intelligence in an academic setting because that's where it started and that's where it's used the most. And as we will see, there are different types of intelligences that never got tested in the same degree. Um, so I'm mental age. It was calculated initially by understanding mental age, which was the average score of children at each age. And then you would take an individual score and relate it to the average score and come up with a number. But now let's just look. This is called a normal distribution, boop, 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 also identified as a bell curve. And in a normal distribution, it's telling you how often each score was um, uh, was um, given. So the most often and the average score on an IQ test is 100, and that's sort of automatically set. So it's not like they give the test and then they do the bell curve and then the exact middle they give the score of 100. So on the actual test, you could end up getting more and more right over the generations, but the middle is always going to be 100. So that's the average IQ. And then this is used to understand the difference between gifted and intellectually disabled. Gifted is above 130. That means that um, it's in the highest 2.1% of people scoring on the test. And uh, intellectual disability is below 70, and that's the lowest 2.1%. So that's the normal distribution, and that's sort of how they get at IQ scores. And there are different types of IQ scores, including the Stanford-Binet intelligence test and the Wechsler intelligence test. And I have a few examples of like the kinds of questions that might be asked. But one of the big problems is that IQ tests have a kind of ugly history of trying to justify racism, and it's just very problematic because as you can see by these questions, a lot of whether or not a child could answer these questions is based on whether they've been exposed to the word dozen, or even have a family that keeps their money in the bank. Like, that has nothing to do with whether the child is intelligent or not. It just means that their family puts money in the bank and have talked about it in front of them. So, this idea of IQ tests as being a full and accurate test of actual intelligence is problematic because of the racial disparities in the scores and the cultural bias of the tests. At the same time, it's something that people like to do, and it is important, especially in terms of um, identifying deficits and making sure that people on this range get the help that they need. Um, I like Gardner's 8 intelligences. I like it not because it's psychometrically important. Like, it's hard to measure. There's reasons why this might be a fantasy, but it's a fantasy that I particularly like if it is, because um, it conceptualizes people as being smart in different ways. For example, you could have an athlete who's not so good at the math or not a particularly gifted writer, but he's brilliant with his body, or a dancer. You could have somebody who's really good with words and not so good with math, right? And that would be kind of me. I score really high on verbal tests and not so high on math tests, or vice versa. You could have someone who's really good at interpersonal intelligence. That's knowing how other people feel and how to form and keep and good relationships. Whereas intrapersonal is knowing how you feel. Someone who's really good at metacognition, that really understand thinking about how you think and putting language to what you feel. So an a novelist would be really good at intrapersonal intelligence, and say a therapist or even maybe a teacher possibly might be good at interpersonal intelligence. And here you have your artist over here. So what's really nice about Gardner's 8 intelligences is it respects that human beings, every human being is good at something. And that's just a sort of philosophical perspective that I think is useful for anybody, especially somebody who's a teacher of students, to really get their mind around. Everybody's going to be good at something, even if they're not good at the one thing. Sternberg also has a multiple intelligence idea, but he's not referred to as multiple intelligence. Erase that from your mind. Sternberg is known for the triarchic theory of intelligence, which breaks things down into these parts: componential, which is an analytical approach to understanding how things are broken down into their component parts and work together. That's analysis. How are breaking things down into their component parts and seeing how the different parts work together to create an effect. Contextual means understanding the practical demands of everyday environments, and experiential is being able to use what you've learned from your life or your experiences and apply them to what you're learning now. So, yeah. So I'm actually asking you to do that when you write your reflection papers, is to really increase your experiential intelligence. And I really now want to stop and emphasize how all of these advances in physical capacity and cognitive thinking capacity are all sort of coming together to help the child form a sense of self. And that is, the sense of self is developed not just through the interaction of these physical and cognitive capacities, but through the social interpretation of those abilities. So let's just take a minute. Self concept, when researched, it's often broken up into these categories. You can have a physical self concept: I'm bad at sports; an emotional self concept: I hate being teased; social self concept: people like me or people don't like me; academic self concept: I'm a great speller. So these are sort of different domains, again, different domains of performance and living, where you could have an idea of whether you're what you like and whether you're successful here or not. And so But all of this is being formed in part by how one sees others seeing the self. In other words, I'm going to think of myself. I'm going to form a self concept in part based on how I think you think of me, right? I can never really know how you think of me. That's something that most children don't. It takes a certain level of maturity to actually admit, I don't know what's going on in your mind. I can never really know how you think of me, but I'm going to think about how you think of me, and um, uh, that's going to help form how I who I think I am. And so, what happens over childhood and during this time is it actually moves from being very concrete external abilities in sort of middle childhood. I'm a fast rider, I'm a fast runner, to more abstract and internal qualities start to um, become part of one's self concept as you become, later childhood. And throughout all of this, you're engaging in social comparison. Upward social comparison is comparing yourselves to others who are more successful than you. And downward social comparison is comparing yourself to others who are less successful than you. So like, look at me. No, this would be downward self. Look at me. I'm better off than those guys. And upwards is like, oh, gee, I'm not doing as good as that one over there is. So I use both in my grad school life. I look at people who I wish I was doing as good as they are, and I also look at others and say, hey, I'm not doing so bad. At least I'm not that far behind on my studies. But this explains, so some distortion, if you're always comparing yourself to others who are more successful than you and never comparing yourself to those less successful to you may actually have a distortion in your self concept. And this explains why people who are proficient at something may feel inept because they're comparing themselves to the top 2%, say. And it may explain why less proficient people who aren't may feel well accomplished because they're never looking to see what the rest of the folks are doing. They're only looking at people who are not as good as them. So it all depends on who they compare themselves to. And you as a parent can step in and become involved in the way that children are comparing themselves to others. You can't, it's foolish to say, don't compare yourself to others because you're gonna. Like, it's human. It's human to compare yourself to others, but you can go and shape the way that they compare themselves to others and provide some metacognitive skills to think about that comparison. Am I just comparing myself upwards to to people better than me? And am I ignoring the comparison with people who aren't as proficient as me? So you can get involved in that. I want to talk about the cycle of self-esteem because as we form our self-concept, we're also forming esteem, evaluating whether we're good at or bad at something. So this idea that I'm good at math, or I'm a bad dancer, or I can't sing. All of these things are being formed during this time. And this is a diagram that comes from another textbook that I use when I teach child development. And it involves this cycle of failure and cycle of success. And I'm just going to walk through it because it's really actually very powerful. So if you start out thinking, hey, I'm not that good at math, say, you're not going to expect to do well. And that low expectation may impact both the effort that you put in, it might reduce your effort, and the anxiety that you have. Two of these things will actually increase your chances of failure. Now you have failed again, and it reinforces your low self esteem. The opposite is true with high self esteem. You could expect to do well. You could have lower anxiety because you don't think you're going to fail. You may increase your effort because you're looking forward to seeing yourself succeed. That all contributes to actual success, and that reinforces your sense that you're good at math, right? One of the things that I just want to highlight to you is when we think about Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, how could you leverage that to break this cycle of failure? Also, think about that teacher, the woman, the mother who taught the girl how to ride the bike. You know, what can be done to break things up so that you can actually create success experiences that break this interpretation of I'm a failure. So I want you to I'm offering that to you to think about that. So one of the key things as we're thinking about like this is we notice here is that there's this idea that effort, reduced effort or increased effort, will actually impact whether there's actual failure or actual success. And one of the things that we read about in our textbook is that Americans tend to undervalue the importance of effort in success and failure and overvalue the importance of ability. So as children are forming their sense of self and their self-concept in response to whether they succeed or fail, and in comparison into as to whether or not other students succeed or fail, we want to pay a lot of attention to how we as adults interpret their success or failure. If we focus as in fixed mindset, if we focus on innate ability, it's because you're good at this, or it's because you're bad at this. If we focus on that, it's related to many, many less favorable outcomes than if we focus on effort. So fixed mindset is focusing on the fixed characteristics of the child because you're just good at this, right? That's fixed. It's sort of more about your personality or something about your innate ability. But growth mindset is focusing on the effort. How much effort did you put into this? Or what kind of effort? Could you make it smarter or wiser? Growth mindset is interpreting success or failure as something that changes based on effort. So the more effort you put in, or the better effort you put in, the more likely you are to succeed. And so it's going to explain failure not as some deficit in who you are as a person, but some deficit in the effort that you put in. And effort is something you can change. You can put in more effort next time. Or you can change your tactics based on efforts that resulted in failure. So it's focusing on growth and learning. Now, this is important. This is important because here we're talking about an example of how parents respond to failure. And I just want to take a moment and think about how we respond to success, right? So we want to be careful in how we use praise, because praise, we see that as like a reward, and we understand from our past chapters about operant conditioning and how rewarding it is to feel praised. But there's a limit. Just as every good thing there's like too much of it can become a bad thing if it's done in the wrong way or there's too much of it. Inflated praise can make a kid feel bad if they have low self-esteem, right? So if you're starting out with low self-esteem and they get an 80 on a math test and you're like, oh my God, that was so good. Like the kid can go, that's overboard. They can like actually disbelieve it. It can ring less. It can ring false. Praising ability instead of performance increases the likelihood of cheating. So this is associated with that praising the fixed mindset. It means I'm going to show you a thing about that next. And then emphasizing that a child is special can lead to narcissism. So this is it's just wiser, even though it's not American. Americans tend to focus on being the best in the extremes of things. And this is something that we can learn from Asian cultures, which tend to focus on the middle path. And when developing a sense of self, this idea of focusing on the middle path instead of like how special you are and how better you are at this than anyone else, focus on like look at how hard you work and look at and see yourself in the middle of people instead of less than or better than, right? You want to see yourself in the middle. This can lead to better outcomes and a happier child. Because believe me, narcissistic people are not, well, I was going to say they're not happy. And I know enough about it that maybe some of them are. But before I go on to that, I just want to show you this result. When they they gave some children an opportunity to do something, and they were either praised based on their effort, not given any feedback at all, or praised based on how good they are at this, their ability. You're so good at this. And then after did that, they were given the opportunity to cheat. Like somebody left the room, they were given another test, they left the room, nobody was looking, theoretically, and they were given the opportunity to cheat. Those who were praised based on their effort, they didn't cheat any more or less than the kids who weren't given any praise at all. But those who were praised based on their ability cheated 60% of the time instead of 40% of the time. And why that is because when you praise ability, then the person's sense of self is based on whether or not they do good on this thing or not. And so then they have to prove that there's too much at risk if your sense of self is based um on your success or failure on a task. So this is why this is an example, like it, so then it can have this ramification that you, in order to protect your sense of self, you're going to cheat so you don't have to, you know, deal with the horrible fact that if I score badly on this, I'm going to be seen as bad at math, say. Lastly, I want to just identify that race and ethnicity interact with self-esteem. And research that was reported in this textbook sh- used white children as a baseline to see how does self-esteem change in Black, Hispanic, and Asian children in relationship to white children over the course of childhood. So starting in early childhood and ending at the end of childhood. And it's kind of fascinating. And I can't actually explain this, but it's just fascinating that um, even though Black children start out childhood with lower self-esteem than white children, they end up with higher self-esteem than white children by age 11. Hispanic children have lower self-esteem than white children and close that gap, have nearly equivalent self-esteem as white children by the end of childhood. And strangely, Asian children tend to start out in early childhood as higher self-esteem than white children and end up with lower self-esteem by end of childhood. Now, what is this? Why is this? One thing we can think about is just that the sense of self can be distorted based on distorted interpretations of ability based on race and ethnicity, right? So if a teacher in a school thinks that people with a certain color skin can't and don't do as well, that could start to become internalized by that child. Or it could be based on whether, you know, your last name seems Hispanic or your parents speak Spanish and not English. So, like, there's all sorts of bias and prejudice that can interfere with a child's self-esteem. But it's very interesting that it's not necessarily like it's very complex and worth studying. But I want to highlight to you that there are protective factors. So even though the society may over and over and over through racial bias and historic systemic racism um, give Black children the sense that they're not worth as much or they don't matter as much, there are protective factors that can actually protect children's sense of self-esteem. And one of those is identifying with the positive aspects of the racial group. So identifying with the racial group and identifying with those positive aspects actually increases your sense of self-esteem relative to the, you know, baseline. Almost done. And then lastly, there's the social identity theory that if you can teach a child that there is such a thing as prejudice and discrimination, that it's societal, it's not you, then that protects a child from interpreting these negative messages as as meaning that they're the problem or valuing themselves lower. So you can protect children from valuing themselves lower, even if the society at large isn't valuing themselves as highly. However, that's great news, but that doesn't mean that we need to stop working to eliminate prejudice and racism. It doesn't belong in our society. And um, I'm excited by the new attention that we're putting on what can we do to reduce this. Um, and with that, that is the end of our discussion of developing mastery. And I hope that through this you can sort of see all of these threads interconnecting, and you can see why this idea of developing mastery in childhood is important, and you can see how what we do to help children succeed at the tasks that they try, and also then interpret their success or failure, um, that can make a big difference in a child's understanding of themselves.